The message began as a distortion barely noticeable in the system-wide Vox traffic, a flicker that should have been dismissed as nothing more than interference from the region's perpetual storms. It carried no signature at first, only a pattern of static that repeated at irregular intervals, as though it struggled against the layers of ice and distance that smothered it. Tech thralls assigned to long-range monitoring attempted to filter it, but the distortion resisted every attempt to categorize or decode it. Only when the signal sharpened for a moment, sharp enough to reveal the ghost of an ident code, did the rune priests take notice. The ident belonged to a warpack that no record showed as active, a designation that had not been used in centuries, a company that, by all accounts, had never returned from its last campaign. The discovery triggered the old protocols reserved for the most improbable of events. The halls of the Fang received the analysis within moments, and the iron bell alarms reserved for matters concerning gene seed or lost kin resounded through stone corridors that had not heard them in generations. The great company chosen to investigate did not assemble with haste or ceremony. Its warriors moved with the silent precision of a hunt called without warning. Each one accepted the summons without question, recognizing instinctively that such a message could not be ignored. Blizzard-born instincts guided them toward the hangar platforms, where their transports waited under the watch of wolf-headed serfs and the distant gaze of Fenrisian skies. The rune priest who had traced the signal stood apart from the gathering warriors. His armor bore the age-polished marks of countless campaigns, each scar shaped by a lifetime spent walking the boundary between the mortal world and the storm spirits whispering through it. He carried no expression of certainty, only the severe focus of one who sensed that the ice itself held its breath. The wind that moved over the platform seemed to shift direction whenever he inhaled, as though it sought to speak and found no words that could match what approached. The strike force departed Fenris under a veil of silence. Engines whispered rather than roared, their tone controlled to the precise pitch required to avoid disturbing the fragile balance of augury that still strained to track the signal. The path toward Frostheim wound through regions of space known for distortions, faint gravitational anomalies, and half-dormant rifts that opened unpredictably before collapsing into themselves again. Warp travel skirted these eddies with the caution of a hunter, avoiding pitfalls hidden beneath snow. During the passage, the warriors moved with rigid purpose. Some prepared their armor with the measured discipline of ritual, carving new marks to signify the nature of the investigation. Others inspected weapons with an instinct sharpened by suspicion more than anticipation. They knew the scent of a battle yet to begin, one that had not offered its face or its form. Even the youngest among them sensed a tension that clung to the air, not born of fear but of inheritance, an ancient thread tied to the Canis Helix itself. The rune priests spent the journey in the center of the storm chamber, tracing the signal's progression across runic matrices formed from interlocking patterns of bone, metal, and ice fragments harvested from worlds long forgotten. Each time the signal spiked in clarity, the chamber's wards flickered as though reacting to something more primal than technology. The vibrations felt less like Vox interference and more like distant howls trapped within the very frequency of the message. As Frostheim approached, the transmissions grew clearer. The ident code fully stabilized for only seconds at a time, but those seconds confirmed what the company already feared. The signal was genuine. It belonged unmistakably to warriors who, by every recorded tradition, had died centuries before. Yet their call persisted, echoing through the void like the final breath of a beast unwilling to lie down in the snow. When the transport descended toward Frostheim's orbit, the moon revealed itself not with grandeur but with an oppressive stillness. Its surface carried the hardened patterns of ancient glaciers that had never known melt, layered over terrain shaped by violent geological shifts. No settlements, no heat signatures, no signs of life, only the silent rhythm of blizzard winds circling endlessly around the moon's fractured basins. The landing sequence took place in an expanse of frozen rock, half consumed by ice shelves. The warriors disembarked without fanfare, their boots pressing into the snow with weight heavy enough to crack crystals buried beneath. The air carried the bite of a deep cold that felt unnatural even to them, cold without motion, cold that pressed against armor as though testing its strength. The signal pulsed again. This time, the The transmission emanated from beneath the ice. The rune priest moved with deliberate steps toward the direction of the pulse. His breaths shifted, condensing into shapes that lingered longer than they should have before dispersing. Behind him, the warriors instinctively widened their formation. Frostheim's surface did not behave like a frozen world. It behaved like a place listening. The first discovery lay half buried in a sheet of compacted snow, deep grooves carved by boots far heavier than those of mortals. The impressions matched the pattern of power armor treads, but the spacing between them suggested movement out of harmony with normal gait. Another set overlapped them, scratches, furrows, and deep claw marks where something powerful had raked across the ice with unnatural precision. The company advanced in silence. They found the second sign near the edge of a broken canyon, a torn segment of armor plating midnight blue, rimmed with gold, scarred from both heat and frost. The symbol engraved on it had weathered with time, but the shape of the rune remained unmistakable. It belonged to the lost war pack. One of their number had fallen here, but the absence of any remains told a different story. Whatever had killed him had carried the body away. The rune priest knelt and placed his gauntleted hand near the torn plating. The ice below reacted in a faint tremor, like fur bristling under a cold wind. Something about the residue felt wrong, not corrupted, not tainted, but altered, like gene seed destabilized by an internal unraveling. The sensation coiled around the air, stretching thin threads of instinct within every warrior present. The company moved deeper toward the source of the signal. Nothing about the terrain suggested habitation or shelter, yet the readings indicated a sunken structure beneath the ice, buried long before the modern age. The landscape began to shift in subtle ways. Scratches on exposed stone where claws had gouged deep. Trails of crushed snow where something enormous had circled a location repeatedly, and faint splashes of frozen blood that had crystallized into dark fragments. The entrance to the buried outpost finally emerged at the base of a frost-split cliff. Massive doors lay cracked open, their hinges frozen mid-break, as though forced outward by strength far exceeding even that of Astartes. No tracks led inside, no tracks led out, only the silence of a tomb waiting for its first breath. The company entered in formation. The darkness inside felt dense enough to follow them, clinging to the edges of their vision as they advanced through corridors lined with symbols of the Imperium, long since dulled by frost. Storage rooms lay ransacked, not by enemy hands but by something that had torn through metal with a ferocity lacking any restraint. Claw marks raked across walls, ceilings, and armor racks with the precision of a predator testing each surface. Near the center of the outpost, they found the chamber from which the signal originated. A beacon lay activated on a pedestal of cracked stone, its interface stuttering but functional. Dust had gathered in layers too thick for recent contact, yet the device pulsed with fresh energy as though touched moments before the company arrived. The rune priest circled the room slowly. He observed the walls caved inward from repeated impacts, the old runes carved into the floor for containment, the faint scent of something neither human nor animal lingering in the air. Every detail suggested a violent struggle from within the chamber, not an invasion from outside. He approached the beacon and touched the ice forming around its emitter. The signal spiked. The chamber lights flickered. Outside, a howl rolled across the frozen landscape, not shaped by any throat known to the Imperium, not formed by any creature of Fenris, but bearing echoes of both. The warriors turned as one, their helmets tracking the sound that approached with certainty, strength, and hunger. The company prepared for contact. The storm answered with silence. Only the ice moved, and somewhere beyond the ridge, something familiar began to circle. Something that once had been one of them. The detachment assigned to investigate the wind-scarred coastline departed the White Scar's forward encampment with a disciplined momentum shaped by decades of training under the relentless doctrines of the 5th Legion, and the sound of their engines merged with the ceaseless roar of the gale sweeping in from the sea, creating a layered rhythm that accompanied their advance across the fractured terrain. Even in the face of the storm's hostility, the warriors maintained a measured formation, each rider aware of the shifting winds, the loose gravel beneath their wheels, and the faint tremor in the air that felt less like weather and more like a presence observing them from just outside the boundaries of sight. As they followed the narrowing ridge that paralleled the ocean, several among them noted an unfamiliar heaviness pressing against their awareness, a weight that did not come from the storm or the cold, but from something intangible, something brushing against their thoughts like distant claws scraping faintly at the inside of their skulls. None spoke, for warriors of the white scars rarely acknowledged such impressions aloud, choosing instead to rely on instinct sharpened by battles fought across 1,000 hostile worlds. Yet each rider understood that the sensation was not natural, and that whatever lay ahead exerted an influence that reached further than stone or air should have allowed. The coastline revealed the first signs of imperial architecture, jutting through layers of fog and sediment, ruined signal towers, collapsed outposts, and fragments of rockcrete walls worn down by centuries of storms. Yet even beneath the decay, the white scars recognized geometric patterns, unmistakably crafted by human engineers. These structures should not have existed here, not on a coastline abandoned long before the sector's formal integration into imperial record, and their sudden appearance raised a new concern about the origin of the distress signal that had prompted this investigation in the first place. Upon approaching the outer perimeter of the first outpost, the detachment dismounted to conduct a methodical assessment. Noting deep gouges carved into the surviving walls, the marks did not resemble the impacts of mass reactive rounds or demolitions, nor did they resemble the claw patterns of known Xenos species, but instead suggested a force that exerted pressure from within, as if something had torn its way out of the structure rather than forcing its way inside. And this implication unsettled the warriors more than any ruin or corpse might have done, because it meant whatever had happened here involved a corruption that spread from the inside outward. Inside the outpost, consoles lay shattered and bent open like ruptured organs. Cables and data coils spilled across the floor in tangled heaps, resembling viscera strewn across a surgical table, and the entire interior carried a subtle distortion, a faint warping of angles and shadows, visible only when viewed from the corner of one's eye, giving the impression that the building itself was struggling to maintain its shape against forces that rejected the material form. Even more disturbing were the marks carved into the walls, symbols etched with deliberate precision, arranged in spirals and jagged sequences that pulsed faintly with residual energy, detectable only through the auto-senses of their helms. Further examination of the ruins revealed the remains of individuals who had once served in the outpost. Fragments of armor fused seamlessly into bone, skulls partially merged with metal plating, and rib cages twisted into unnatural configurations as if molded by invisible hands. Such grotesque fusion was not the work of explosions, toxins, or biological weapons, but something born of a corruptive influence that reshaped flesh and machine according to a logic that violated the principles of nature. And although the white scars had borne witness to countless horrors throughout the galaxy, this particular transformation told them that the victims had been claimed not by conventional enemies, but by a presence that sought dominion over both body and mind. When the warriors reached the central chamber, they discovered the primary Vox array still functioning, though barely, humming with an uneven, almost organic rhythm that resonated through the floor like the heartbeat of a creature buried beneath the earth. Upon closer inspection, they realized the distress signal they were investigating was not a live broadcast at all, but a corrupted imprint left upon the machinery, a scream stretched into an endless loop by some violent, anomalous pulse that had seared itself into the array's systems, creating the illusion of a distress call long after its operator had perished. Before they could analyze the machine further, the wind outside shifted suddenly, its pitch dropping into a resonant moan that echoed through the entire structure and caused fine fractures to spiderweb across the interior walls. The air thickened with a distortion that seemed to pulse in time with the broken Vox array, and even the storm itself felt as though it had been seized by an unseen will. Recognizing the unnatural shift, the squad returned to their bikes, finding the fog outside had grown impossibly dense, coiling in tendrils that drifted along the ground like crawling phantoms that dissolved whenever one attempted to look directly at them. Within moments of mounting up, the ground beneath them began to tremble ever so slightly, a subtle vibration that felt less like weather-beaten stone and more like something vast shifting beneath the earth. And as the squad leader signaled for immediate withdrawal to relay their findings, the riders discovered that the path they had followed earlier had changed. Rock formations that had not existed an hour before now blocked sections of the route, arranged with the same ritualistic geometry they had seen inside the outpost, forming a labyrinth designed not to trap them completely but to delay their escape, as though whatever influence had corrupted the ruins now sought to buy itself more time. The white scars accelerated, engines roaring as they weaved through the shifting landscape, navigating not by visible markers but by instinct, honed through countless battles fought on treacherous terrain. The fog pressed around them like a net cast by a patient predator, thinning only when they forced their momentum forward with reckless, determined speed. All the while, an oppressive psychic pressure pulsed at the edges of their consciousness, probing their thoughts with cold, impersonal curiosity, seeking weaknesses to exploit. Despite this, the detachment broke through the worst of the distortion, emerging onto a clearer stretch of coastline, where the wind resumed its natural cadence and the sky regained its normal color. Though they did not slow, each rider sensed that the entity or force behind the outpost's corruption had not truly withdrawn, but had merely retreated into the unseen depths where it could continue shaping its influence over the land. Once they reached a vantage point overlooking their route back to the primary encampment, the squad leader understood the urgency of their discovery. The corrupted signal, the warped remains, the unnatural distortions in both matter and weather, all of it pointed toward an enemy whose presence had already established itself along the coast, an enemy that sought concealment until the moment of its choosing, an enemy that threatened not only their mission but potentially the entire campaign. With engines roaring beneath them, the warriors accelerated back toward the Khan's position, fully aware that their report would alter the course of the conflict, because whatever had marked the coastline with its presence was not done with this world, and the 5th Legion would soon confront a threat that cared nothing for speed, steel, or mortal resistance, a threat that had already begun to seep through the cracks in reality itself. The return journey carried a sharpened tension that neither the wind nor the storm could mask, for the riders now moved with the full weight of knowledge pressing against their thoughts, knowledge that revealed the coastline not as a desolate frontier, but as the boundary of something awakening beneath the land. Their engines roared with greater urgency as they retraced the path toward the forward encampment, and each warrior kept his gaze fixed ahead while remaining acutely aware of the presence that continued to shift at the edges of perception. Though the fog had thinned behind them, the memory of its unnatural movements clung to their senses like residue from a toxin that could not be expelled. As they crossed the final ridge overlooking the White Scar's temporary fortifications, the encampment appeared unchanged at first glance, its defensive emplacements and patrol routes operating with disciplined regularity. Yet to the returning squad, the familiar structures carried a new fragility, as if the corruption they had encountered along the coastline had subtly altered the proportions of everything they now saw. They rode through the perimeter without ceremony, drawing the attention of nearby warriors who sensed the shift in their bearing, and even before the squad leader signaled his intent, messengers surged forward to announce their immediate audience with the Khan. The detachment was escorted into the command pavilion where the air felt unnaturally still, as though the storm outside hesitated to intrude upon the space. Here, the returning riders delivered their findings in a rapid, structured report, detailing the corrupted outpost, the fused remains, the shifting landscape, and the oppressive psychic presence that had tainted their journey. Though the 5th Legion was known for its outward speed, its commanders were expected to think with precision, and the Khan's senior officers absorbed each detail with grave composure. The implications spread like fractures through a pane of glass, revealing a threat whose reach extended beyond a mere region of coastline. Once the report was completed, the returning riders were dismissed to recover, yet recovery proved impossible, as traces of the distortion lingered within their minds. Their bodies obeyed routine checking armor seals, inspecting engines, cleansing dust from the joints of their mounts, but their thoughts carried the imprint of the symbols carved into the outpost walls and the unnatural harmony of the corrupted Vox signal. Even the air within the encampment seemed subtly altered, stirring in faint rhythms that evoked memories of the coastline's pulsing atmosphere. While the detachment attempted to center themselves through movement, drills, and the maintenance rituals that shaped every White Scar's discipline, the Khan and his council prepared a full-scale response. Their encampment shifted from routine readiness to heightened alert, with the efficiency expected of a legion forged in constant motion. Patrol patterns tightened, perimeter sensors were recalibrated, and riders were assigned rapid intercept routes in case the corruption attempted to advance inland. The warriors of the 5th Legion adapted with practiced ease, yet beneath the surface of their discipline lay the unspoken recognition that the threat they faced belonged not to the realm of conventional warfare. Throughout the following hours, the returning squad found themselves revisited by sensations they had hoped to leave behind: brief flashes of the shifting fog, the faint suggestion of movement where none existed, and subtle tremors beneath the soil that did not register on external instruments but traveled through their bones as though the ground itself remembered what they had seen. These impressions surfaced not as hallucinations but as echoes, lingering residues of the corrupted presence that had observed them along the coast. Though none expressed discomfort, each sensed that whatever had reached for them had not fully released its grip. As dusk deepened, the atmosphere around the encampment grew heavier. Patrols reported unusual distortions of sound, whispers carried upon the wind, faint tremors vibrating through the defensive stakes, and occasional pulses of pressure that rippled across the ground in patterns too uniform to be natural. The returning detachment recognized these phenomena instantly, for they mirrored the conditions that had preceded the disturbances at the outpost. Their unease grew not from fear but from certainty, a certainty that the corruption had already extended its influence farther inland than they had initially believed. Later that night, while the encampment operated under heightened vigilance, the squad leader found himself replaying the memory of the coastline not as a sequence of events, but as a progression of patterns. The fused remains, the ritual markings, the distorted signal, all aligned with the behavior of entities that thrived on infiltration rather than direct confrontation. The realization settled upon him with the weight of inevitability. The corruption had not sought to destroy the outpost but to reshape it, turning its structures and personnel into conduits for a larger incursion. What the squad had witnessed was not the result of an attack, but the first stage of a transformation. Across the encampment, similar thoughts began to surface among the riders who had accompanied him. The 5th Legion valued intuition as much as analytics, and each warrior understood instinctively when a battlefield had expanded beyond its visible boundaries. Conversations remained unspoken, yet the air between them carried a shared understanding that the corruption would not remain confined to the coastline. Their encounter had not closed the door to the threat, it had opened a path for it. As the night advanced, the storm intensified without warning. Winds rose into a violent crescendo that battered the encampment from every direction, and the previously steady rhythm of the weather transformed into chaotic surges that struck in irregular pulses. Instruments failed to track the storm's pattern, and for a brief moment the perimeter sensors flickered with interference identical to the distortions encountered at the outpost. Warriors moved to their positions immediately, recognizing this not as weather but as the arrival of the entity that had waited beneath the coastline for its moment to strike. The returning detachment felt the shift before the alarms sounded. A pressure swept across their minds, not as an attack but as a probing touch, a searching presence evaluating the encampment's strengths and vulnerabilities. The sensation lasted only an instant, yet in that instant the warriors understood that the corruption had found them, tracked them, and now reached toward the heart of their formation with the intent to breach it. Though the storm raged outside, though the ground trembled beneath the encampment, though the threat revealed itself in the rising howl of the corrupted wind, the warriors of the 5th Legion stood ready not because they believed they understood the enemy, but because they had accepted that motion was the only answer, and that whatever emerged from the darkness would be met not with hesitation but with the relentless force of warriors who had crossed the galaxy on the razor's edge of speed and survival. The storm's arrival did not break over the encampment like a natural force but descended with the deliberate cadence of a presence announcing itself, and the White Scars felt the shift long before the first impact of wind hammered against their defenses. The air thickened with a vibration that traveled not across the ground but through the mind, a subtle resonance that threaded itself into thought with an invasive precision, neither mechanical nor psychic, yet carrying the unmistakable intention of something aware, something watching, and something learning. Warriors moved to their positions with disciplined swiftness, but even their practiced efficiency could not fully mask the sense that the storm now possessed a shape. The first gust struck with a discordant howl that rose in pitch as it swept across the encampment, a howl that carried the faint echo of human timbre woven through its core, as if some distant voice had been caught within the wind and stretched beyond recognition. The sound dragged across armored plating and weapon mounts like claws testing the boundaries of their materials, and the vibrations that followed shook banners, tents, and sensor arrays, as though the storm sought to understand the strengths of the structures it assailed. White scars braced themselves, not because the wind threatened their bodies, but because the noise pressed against the edges of their consciousness, a noise that felt too deliberate to be dismissed. When the second wave of wind surged inward, its force scattered dust and debris in spiraling patterns that twisted in ways the natural airflow could not explain. The returning squad recognized the pattern instantly, for it mirrored the circular distortions carved into the walls of the coastline outpost. The similarity extinguished any remaining doubt. The corruption had followed them inland, not carried passively by weather but drawn by the imprint of their presence, as though the riders themselves had become conduits through which the entity extended its reach. Sensor arrays crackled under the pressure as the storm disrupted every attempt to read its composition, producing feedback that flickered through the encampment's equipment like an electrical seizure. Instruments that should have measured wind speed and atmospheric density instead produced fractured readouts of static and symbols that appeared for a moment before dissolving into incomprehensible noise. And the interference suggested not a malfunction, but a deliberate manipulation by the same force that had corrupted the outpost's Vox systems. The White Scars understood this instinctively, for they had encountered enemies who weaponized the immaterial before, and the signature now rippling through the storm carried the unmistakable cadence of manipulation rather than chance. Across the defensive lines, warriors secured their firing arcs and adjusted their footing against the gale. Yet even as they prepared themselves for a physical foe, an underlying tension whispered through the ranks. The storm pressed in waves, not continuously, and each lull carried the impression of something inhaling something vast, something unseen, something gathering the next pulse of force with a predatory patience. The unnatural cadence gnawed at their instincts, not inspiring fear but amplifying alertness, sharpening the edges of their perception to a fine blade. The squad that had returned from the coastline took position together near the encampment's central barricades, forming an anchor point amid the shifting wind. Their armor bore the faint scratches, dust patterns, and lingering distortions of the outpost encounter, marks that the storm now seemed to recognize. The pressure of the wind intensified whenever it swept across them, as if the entity behind the storm were focusing its attention upon the warriors who had witnessed its early manifestations. The sensation was not one of hostility alone, but of recognition, as though the corruption regarded them as familiar shapes in a landscape it sought to claim. As the storm escalated, the sky darkened into a deep, violet-gray shroud that swallowed the horizon and blurred the distant ridges. Lightning flickered through the clouds with a stuttering rhythm that failed to align with natural atmospheric discharge, illuminating the encampment in flashes that revealed the shifting fog coiling just beyond the defensive perimeter. The fog moved against the wind, dragging itself across the ground with an inverted flow that defied the storm's direction, and its tendrils reached outward like extensions of the gale's will. The White Scars tightened their formation as the fog pressed closer, observing its movement with a tactical calm born from years of confronting threats few mortals could comprehend. The fog did not advance in a single mass, but instead broke into clusters that drifted with individual intent, each cluster tracing patterns reminiscent of the gouges carved into the outpost walls. When the fog passed across discarded equipment or exposed rock, the material beneath it altered slightly, as though the fog etched faint lines into everything it touched, marking the physical environment the same way it marked minds. The returning detachment felt that imprint more acutely than the others. A low vibration rose through their armor, as if the fog recognized their earlier proximity and reacted to it. The sensation traveled through their bones in waves, beginning at the extremities and converging at the spine, tightening into a pressure that pulsed in synchrony with the storm's unnatural rhythm. The warriors did not flinch, yet the persistent tension in their muscles revealed the weight of the presence that now pressed against them from every direction. The wind rose again, this time carrying with it a deep, resonant hum that harmonized with the fog's movements. The sound crawled along the encampment's metal surfaces, causing them to tremble with a vibration that felt like the structural equivalent of breath. Observing the interplay of sound and fog, the White Scars recognized that the entity was testing its range, pushing against the boundaries of the material world with increasing force. The corruption did not yet manifest physically, but its presence now extended beyond mere distortion. It was shaping the battlefield in preparation for something greater. When the hum peaked, the storm's pressure converged into a single pulse that surged through the ground, lifting a thin layer of dust from the soil in a ripple that spread outward like a shockwave. The pulse struck every warrior simultaneously, not with kinetic force but with an invasive psychic resonance that reached through armor, flesh, and bone. For a fraction of a second, every rider perceived a flicker of movement beneath the earth, shapes that squirmed within the soil like embryonic forms seeking emergence. The impression faded quickly, but the message remained. The corruption was no longer content to distort the air or twist the senses. It had begun to manifest directly within the land. The White Scars braced themselves as the storm gathered anew, understanding that this was only an introduction. The entity behind the corruption had revealed its presence not to declare itself, but to test the strength of the warriors who would stand against it. And as the wind regained its unnatural rhythm, pressing against the encampment with renewed intent, the riders of the 5th Legion prepared to meet whatever emerged next, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with the relentless resolve of warriors who had learned long ago that speed alone could not escape every storm, and that some storms could only be conquered by riding straight into their heart. The storm did not recede after its last unnatural pulse. Instead, it settled into a new rhythm that throbbed across the encampment like a second heartbeat, slow at first, then deepening with each passing moment, as though something beneath the surface drew in breath. The White Scars felt the shift immediately, for the gale no longer pressed against them with uniform force. It moved instead in concentrated waves that flowed across the camp in deliberate paths, sweeping past warriors and equipment as if tracing patterns only the entity behind the corruption could perceive. The wind's pressure gathered and released in cycles of intent, studying, probing, and preparing. Every warrior sensed that the moment of observation was ending. Along the defensive perimeter, the fog thickened into denser coils that wrapped themselves around barricades and equipment, clinging to metal with an adhesive grip that defied the storm's outward push. Where the fog touched the ground, faint lines etched into the soil lines that mirrored the patterns carved into the walls of the corrupted outpost. Warriors placed nearby recognized the markings instantly, and though their composure remained steady, each understood the significance. The corruption was beginning to imprint itself physically upon the landscape. What had begun as atmospheric distortion had grown into an invasive process, rewriting the terrain one breath at a time. At the encampment's center, the returning squad remained together, for the pressure that circulated through the storm seemed to converge upon them more intensely than anywhere else. The lingering traces of the coastline still clung to their armor, invisible to the eye but unmistakable to whatever presence now pressed closer. The sensation crawled across their skin beneath the ceramite, a crawling awareness that did not come from touch, but from the impression of an intelligence evaluating them through layers of metal and bone. The familiarity of its attention marked them as recipients of its first contact, and now it followed the trace back to its source. Suddenly, the ground beneath the central barricades trembled in a slow, deliberate pulse, an undulating motion that traveled from one end of the encampment to the other, lifting dust and shards of stone into the air. The tremor was not strong enough to topple fortifications, but strong enough that every warrior felt it resonate through his boots and up into his spine. The pulse carried no kinetic violence. Instead, it bore a psychic pressure that sank into the mind like a cold blade, drawing awareness downward to something stirring beneath the soil. The White Scars exchanged glances not of fear but of anticipation. They understood now that the corruption was not arriving, it was awakening. The second tremor came with greater force, rising from the earth with a rhythm that mimicked the storm's pulse above, creating a harmonic vibration that could be felt in armor seams and weapon grips. Instruments flickered once more, their readouts collapsing into chaotic distortions that bore no resemblance to atmospheric or seismic data, as though the very act of measurement offended whatever force was rising from below. The returning squad felt this more clearly than the rest, for a sudden pressure struck the center of their minds with concentrated intensity, compressing their thoughts into a single moment of clarity. The presence beneath the ground recognized them. Then the fracture came. It began with a sharp crack that cut through the storm's howl, a single rupture in the soil that echoed throughout the encampment with the unmistakable precision of something forcing its way upward. Warriors shifted into ready formation as the crack spread in jagged lines across the ground, opening just wide enough for faint tendrils of fog to pour upward from within. The fog carried with it a coldness that contrasted violently with the storm's heat. A coldness that did not chill flesh, but froze the mind's defenses for a heartbeat. The fog swirled upward in thin, searching tendrils that drifted across the formation of warriors nearest the fracture, examining them as deliberately as a surgeon might examine a specimen. The returning squad felt the fog converge toward their position, drawn to the lingering resonance that marked them as the entity's first witnesses. The fog coiled around their legs and armor, not binding them but tracing delicate paths across the ceramite, as though attempting to map the structure of their forms. The sensation crawling up their legs felt wrong, not tactile, not psychic, but something in between, something that sought to learn the contours of their physicality by sliding across the intersection of matter and thought. It moved with the unmistakable deliberation of a mind shaping its first physical interaction with the world above. As the fog concentrated around them, the fracture widened, splitting the ground open with a slow, grinding motion that revealed deeper layers of soil and stone. Warriors across the encampment tightened their lines, shifting into offense positions that allowed both movement and reaction. The Khan's senior riders took calculated stances, their instincts aligning with centuries of White Scar's doctrine that recognized the first emergence of an unseen enemy as the most dangerous moment in any confrontation. Yet, even with this awareness, the corruption's next motion defied their expectations. From the fracture rose a column of fog that twisted upon itself, coalescing not into a form, but into the suggestion of a mass that extended upward, with an uncertain outline that flickered like a half-formed memory. The shape did not yet resemble anything living or dead, but its attempts to mimic form suggested the early stages of manifestation. The entity had tested the air and the mind, now it sought to test the body. The column convulsed once, then erupted outward in a blast of force that struck the returning squad directly, not strong enough to throw them from their feet, but concentrated enough to penetrate their armor's outer layers with a psychic sting. The sensation was sharp, cold, and immediate. A probing strike that felt more like an introduction than an attack. Though the warriors did not buckle, each felt the entity searching through their memories with a cold curiosity, trying to extract impressions of their faces, their movements, and the coastline where it had first touched their minds. The fog withdrew just as suddenly, collapsing inward toward the fracture, as though the entity had learned what it needed and now prepared for the next stage of emergence. The ground trembled again, this time with the unmistakable cadence of something gathering strength, something pushing upward, something preparing to break fully into the world above. The White Scars recognized the shift instantly, for the tremors carried the rhythm of an imminent breach, an enemy forcing its way into open battle. Their formation tightened, their engines ignited, their minds sharpened. The next pulse would not be a warning. It would be the arrival. The fracture continued to widen with a slow, deliberate precision that unnerved even the most seasoned among the White Scars, for the motion bore none of the chaotic violence expected of a natural upheaval. Instead, the ground split apart, as though obeying the command of something beneath it, reacting like a living organism preparing to reveal a buried limb. The tremors that accompanied the widening breach traveled outward in measured pulses that synchronized with the unnatural cadence of the corrupted storm above, forming a rhythm that turned the entire encampment into a resonant chamber for something rising toward the surface. The fog that had withdrawn moments before began to coil again along the fracture's edges, thickening with each pulse of the tremors. Its texture shifted from thin vapor into a denser medium that clung to the soil in tendrils, each movement displaying a growing confidence as the entity learned to manipulate the physical world with greater refinement. The white scars felt an increasing pressure in the air, not from heat or wind, but from a psychic force attempting to anchor itself to the material plane. The returning squad recognized the sensation instantly, for it mirrored the precise moment at the coastline when the corruption had first reached for them through the storm, only now the contact was far more deliberate. The ground near the fracture bulged upward as something pressed from below, distorting the soil into mounds that rose and fell in rhythmic pulses. The movement suggested not a singular creature but multiple forms converging toward a central point, merging or intertwining beneath the earth as though assembling themselves. The warriors adjusted their stance, aware that the enemy might not emerge as a single mass, but as a cluster of manifestations shaped by the corrupted presence. Their instincts urged them to charge, to close the distance with speed, and tear apart whatever attempted to rise, yet discipline held them in place, for the nature of the threat remained uncertain, and striking prematurely risked playing into the entity's intent. A sudden vibration crawled across the entire encampment, passing through armor and bone like a ripple of cold steel dragged along the spine. The pulse originated directly from the fracture, where a new disturbance formed a low, resonant hum that deepened into a complex harmonic pattern. The sound was faint at first, then grew until it reverberated across every surface. It was not speech, not thought, and yet carried a sense of communication, as though the entity was attempting to replicate a form of expression using the only medium it possessed: vibration. The fog reacted instantly to the harmonic pulse, spiraling upward in a column that extended several meters into the air before collapsing inward to form an unstable mass suspended above the fracture. The mass flickered with movement, shifting between elongated shapes and compressed clusters, attempting repeatedly to settle into a coherent outline. Each attempt produced a form more complex than the last: a limb, a torso-like column, or something resembling the arc of a spine, though the results never remained stable. The warriors observed with grim discipline, aware that the entity was learning, adapting, and refining itself with each failure. The column's movements accelerated. Tendrils of fog extended outward, tracing patterns along the ground and across pieces of fallen debris. Where the fog touched metal, the surface shifted subtly, adopting faint patterns that mirrored the symbols carved into the outpost walls. Where it touched bare soil, the ground darkened as though absorbing some aspect of the corruption. The formation seemed to feed off its environment, drawing strength from the materials around it. Each pulse of the storm overhead strengthened the growing shape, and with every iteration, it more closely approximated the outline of a being capable of interacting physically with the world above. The returning squad felt a familiar pressure build within their minds, a cold, prying sensation that crawled along the edges of their thoughts like a predator testing the limits of a cage. They recognized that the entity was attempting once again to analyze them, to extract the final details it needed to stabilize its form. The warriors clenched their grips and prepared for an assault, understanding that the next phase of manifestation would not be as passive as the last. What rose from the fracture would no longer be a harmless construct of vapor and light, but something capable of violence. The fog drew inward sharply, collapsing into a dense core that pulsed with a lightless energy. The ground trembled beneath the concentrated mass, and the soil cracked outward in jagged lines. The pulse of the storm intensified, merging with the rhythm of the tremors until the two forces became indistinguishable. For a moment, the encampment felt suspended in time. Every warrior braced, every engine rumbling, every breath held. Then the shape emerged. A limb of condensed matter, formed from fog that had hardened into something neither solid nor fluid, thrust upward from the fracture. It resembled a twisted arm, yet bore no muscle or bone, instead composed of swirling layers of darkness that moved in spirals. The appendage anchored itself against the ground, gripping the soil with a force that cracked stone, and another limb followed this one, more stable, more defined, as though the entity refined its structure with each manifestation. The body rose next, a towering mass that flickered between humanoid and inhuman forms with every pulse of the storm. The shape was unstable, yet the intent behind it was clear. It was assembling a vessel, a shell through which it could act with strength and precision. The warriors felt the presence now fully, not merely observing but entering, forcing itself into a world that resisted its arrival. The storm overhead roared as if to accompany the entity's ascent, the wind no longer battering the encampment but circling it, drawn inward by the gravitational pull of the manifestation. The entity struggled only briefly before stabilizing its upper mass into something that resembled a torso, though its proportions were fluid and wrong. The face that began to form lacked features, its surface shifting like liquid shadow attempting to mimic anatomy. The sight did not evoke fear but an instinctual recognition that the thing before them should not exist in any physical domain, and yet it stood, held together by a force that defied every law of nature the Legion had ever known. The white scars tightened their lines. The entity took its first step, and the ground shook in answer. The entity's first step did not land upon the soil as a simple act of locomotion, but as a declaration of intent, for the ground recoiled inward beneath its mass, as though burdened by the presence of something it was never meant to bear. The soil rippled outward in concentric waves that distorted the terrain and sent vibrations trembling through the encampment's fortifications. Warriors steadied themselves instinctively, adjusting their stances with the precision of veterans who understood that even the slightest imbalance could open a path to disaster. The returning squad felt the pressure most acutely, as if each tremor carried their names within its resonance, marking them as the entity's first chosen signposts in a world it had only just begun to explore. The shape continued to rise, its unstable form drawing inward the surrounding fog, consolidating its density with each movement. Where the fog touched its surface, the outline thickened, assuming a more cohesive structure that betrayed a growing understanding of physicality. Its limbs lengthened with unsettling irregularity, shifting between shapes that resembled animalistic appendages and elongated human proportions. What emerged was not a fixed organism but a fluid construct of intention, molded by a presence that sought a balance between existence and distortion. Its torso pulsed with a dim, internal rhythm, sending waves of darkened energy through its frame, and each pulse strengthened its coherence. Around the creature, the storm responded in kind. The wind became a circular vortex that concentrated around the entity, pulling debris, dust, and fragments of metal into spiraling arcs that never touched the ground. The sky above dimmed not through cloud density but as if light itself withdrew, unwilling to illuminate the aberration rising from the earth. Lightning flashed irregularly across the vortex, illuminating the shifting forms of the creature's limbs and casting momentary glimpses of its flawed attempts at symmetry. Yet even its failures revealed a rapid evolution, as though each instability informed the next stage of refinement. The white scars did not retreat. Instead, they tightened their formation, drawing upon an instinctive unity that arose naturally in moments of profound threat. Their engines rumbling in readiness filled the air with a counter-rhythm to the storm's pulse, a reminder that while the enemy's presence defied the natural world, the warriors who stood against it embodied the raw spirit of momentum. The returning squad, marked by the creature's recognition, took the front line without hesitation. Their armor vibrated with the oppressive psychic force radiating from the entity, yet they endured it with disciplined resolve, their focus sharpened by the memory of what they had witnessed on the coastline. As the entity lifted its second limb from the breach, the ground responded with greater resistance. The soil cracked deeper, revealing veins of dark material woven through the earth like buried roots that pulsed in synchrony with the entity's movements. These veins glowed faintly, emitting a sickly luminescence that spread beneath the surface, as though the creature's rising mass was awakening dormant corruption from within the world itself. The sudden emergence of the glowing pathways sent a wave of unease through the encampment, for their presence suggested the creature was not merely an intruder, but a catalyst for something far older and more insidious. When the entity finally established its full height, towering above the encampment, the fog surrounding it withdrew, as though paying deference to its completed form. Its upper mass solidified into an approximation of a humanoid torso, broad, distorted, and rippling with layered textures that shifted like living shadow. Where a face should have been, only a featureless surface remained, smooth and reflective like the surface of dark water. This blank visage faced the white scars, though no eyes existed for it to see. Yet every warrior felt its attention pressing against them, not through sight, but through an invasive presence that threaded itself into their perception. The entity raised its arm with a slow, deliberate motion, and the air around it bent inward. A shockwave of compressed pressure radiated outward in all directions, striking the nearest barricades with enough force to splinter reinforced beams and scatter equipment. Warriors braced themselves as the wave rippled through their formation, pushing against their armor with a weight that threatened to crush lungs and fracture ribs beneath ceramite. Yet they stood firm, anchoring their bodies with trained precision and resisting the force through sheer will. The shockwave subsided, leaving behind a momentary silence that felt more ominous than any preceding tremor. The entity's torso pulsed brightly, its featureless face turning toward the returning squad with unmistakable recognition. The psychic pressure intensified, clawing through their minds in a crescendo of probing force. Memories flashed unbidden glimpses of the coastline, the corrupted outpost, the fog's shifting patterns. The entity mined these impressions with relentless efficiency, stripping them of context and emotion, reducing them to raw data that it assimilated into its evolving consciousness. Then, the entity advanced. Its steps were heavy, slow, and methodical, yet each one carried the weight of controlled intent. It did not rush, but moved with the precision of a force that understood its superiority in scale and density. The ground behind it warped beneath its mass, bending inward, as though the earth itself sought to swallow the contamination, but lacked the strength to do so. Warriors across the encampment shifted to intercept positions, engines growling with imminent release. But they waited for the signal that would determine the moment of engagement. The entity responded to the drawn formation by raising both limbs, their density solidifying into weapons of pure distortion, incapable of sharpness, yet carrying crushing potential. A pulse surged outward from its core, darkening the already dim light and casting the encampment into a distorted twilight. The next moment of motion would determine the fate of the white scars within reach. The entity attacked, and the world answered with the sound of engines igniting in unison. The instant the entity launched its first strike, the encampment erupted into motion as every engine ignited in unified response, filling the air with the thunderous resonance of the Legion's war mounts. The sound clashed against the distortion radiating from the creature's movements, creating a violent symphony of momentum and unnatural force. The first wave of riders surged forward, their formation splitting wide to encircle the entity in a maneuver built upon calculated precision and years of battlefield mastery. Their wheels tore through soil and dust, kicking up spirals of grit that burned through the fragmented fog like streaks of light cutting through darkness. The entity's limbs swung downward with crushing intent, and the ground erupted beneath its blow in a burst of shattered stone and compressed soil. The shockwave rippled outward in jagged patterns that destabilized the terrain, cracking open fissures that forced some riders to swerve wildly to maintain balance. Yet the white scars adapted with a fluid grace that defied the magnitude of the impact. Their experience in navigating unstable landscapes allowed them to drift over the disturbed ground without losing momentum. Each rider adjusted instinctively, flowing around the fractures, as though the earth itself formed part of the strategy. As the first riders closed the gap, the entity shifted its upper mass with disturbing fluidity, its torso twisting unnaturally to track the movement of the formation. Its limbs elongated and contracted, reshaping themselves to optimize reach, density, and angle. It struck again, but this time its movements were faster, refined by the data it had extracted from the squad's memories. The blow tore through the air with enough force to distort the visual field, creating a momentary blur that swallowed the space between motion and impact. Yet the riders anticipated it, splitting their formation further to avoid the crushing sweep. The returning squad, marked by the entity's recognition, formed the leading edge of the assault. Their engines roared with a resonance deeper than the others, as though their mounts sensed the threat and responded with heightened aggression. They weaved through the battlefield in a coordinated sequence, crossing paths at tight angles to create intersecting lines of attack that forced the entity to divide its awareness across multiple trajectories. Their speed carved temporary distortions into the fog, scattering the corrupted vapor in chaotic flurries that momentarily disrupted the creature's attempts to track them. The entity retaliated with a burst of force that radiated from its core, a shockwave more focused than the earlier pulses. The blast struck the ground in a narrow cone, tearing apart a section of the encampment and sending debris scattering across the battlefield. Several riders narrowly avoided the destructive wave, veering sharply as the ground disintegrated behind them. The shockwave had deliberately targeted the returning squad, following the psychic imprint left upon them. The entity had learned their patterns and attempted to counter them directly, adapting more quickly with each encounter. Yet adaptation worked both ways. The white scars responded with a shift of formation that redefined the battlefield instantly. The outer riders accelerated into a spiraling pattern, creating a cyclone of dust and momentum that forced the entity to reorient its limbs to track their rapid circular movement. Meanwhile, the inner riders tightened their approach, using the distraction to cut into the entity's peripheral arcs. Their engines screamed with raw force as they surged toward the entity's unstable joints, aiming not to wound, since wounding was meaningless against such a form, but to disrupt its balance and force it into defensive realignment. The entity staggered, its limbs adjusting mid-motion in a desperate attempt to maintain equilibrium. The ground beneath its massive frame buckled under the sudden redistribution of weight, and cracks spread outward like a web. The creature's torso distorted again, collapsing inward, before re-expanding in a shock of ripple-like waves that indicated instability within its core structure. The white scars pressed this advantage, diving into close-range passes that forced the entity to expend energy, recalibrating its shape. Suddenly, the creature lashed outward with a limb that split into multiple tendrils mid-swing, transforming a single strike into a fragmentation of assaults that scattered in divergent paths. Several riders were caught at the edge of the tendrils, their bikes thrown off course by the sudden psychic backlash. Armor vibrated violently as the tendrils grazed them, leaving trails of corrupted energy that pulsed faintly along their plating. The sensation was not physical pain, but a hollow pulling at the mind, as though the entity sought to extract something from their consciousness. Yet the riders endured, stabilizing their mounts, even as the tendrils dissolved back into the creature's shifting limb. The returning squad continued to circle the entity with relentless precision. Their positioning was no longer just strategy, it was personal. The creature's attention remained fixed upon them, drawn by the imprint of their first encounter, and this fixation allowed the rest of the formation to strike with greater freedom. The returning squad embraced the burden, moving with a defiant momentum that carved arcs of speed across the battlefield, forcing the entity to divide its focus again and again. As the battle intensified, the storm above reacted. Lightning tore across the sky in jagged lines, illuminating the battlefield in violent flashes that cast the riders and the entity in harsh, shifting silhouettes. The wind spiraled downward in focused columns that followed the entity's movements, as if the storm itself were an extension of its will. Dust and debris rose into twisting columns that threatened visibility and footing, yet the white scars thrived within the chaos, for storms were familiar companions in their long history of war. The battle reached its peak as the entity attempted a final recalibration of form. Its mass condensed inward, collapsing into a denser shape that pulsed with an ominous power. The fog withdrew from the battlefield, sucked into the creature's core as though consumed for fuel. The ground trembled beneath the sudden surge of energy, and a deep vibration crawled up through the wheels of the riders' mounts. The entity was preparing something, a strike, a transformation, or an emergence that would redefine the battlefield completely. The white scars pushed harder, surging as one into a unified assault. The moment the entity completed its contraction, the world held its breath. And then, it expanded. When the entity expanded, the battlefield transformed in an instant, as space contorted under the weight of a force that could not be measured, a rippling distortion radiating outward like a shockwave made of bent dimensions rather than mere energy. The compressed fog that had been drawn into the creature burst outward in a violent eruption that scattered corrupted vapor across the entire veil, turning the air into a fractured haze of twisting currents and unstable light. Every rider felt the pressure swell around them, a suffocating density that pressed against armor and flesh as though the atmosphere itself sought to crush the motion from their bodies. Engines sputtered for a fraction of a second before the riders forced them back into full throttle, embracing speed as the only means of resisting the psychic compression. The entity had grown taller and broader, its limbs elongating into massive pillars that anchored into the ground like roots sinking into soil. Its torso had widened substantially, and its core pulsed with a violent luminosity that cast the battlefield in shades of violet and sickly gold. Its movements had slowed, but not because of weakness. Rather, the creature was stabilizing, transforming into a form capable of exerting crushing influence over the terrain. The ground around its base warped, bending upward in jagged angles that created unnatural ridges and ruptures. The earth was no longer earth, but an extension of the creature's internal geometry, reshaping the battlefield into a zone where physics frayed at the edges. The White Scars felt the shift instantly. Their mounts resisted the corrupted terrain, wheels grinding against surfaces that seemed to shift beneath them like living matter. Yet the riders adapted, relying on instinct, sharpened across thousands of storms and shifting landscapes. They angled their bikes to counter the changing pull of gravity, weaving between rising ridges and collapsing trenches in motions that seemed impossible to an untrained eye. Their formation splintered into multiple layers of maneuvering, each group carving paths across distorted terrain as they sought avenues to strike at the entity's newly stabilized form. The returning squad moved closest to the creature, driven by momentum and purpose. Their engines roared louder than the rest, operating at limits that pushed their mounts to the brink of collapse. The shockwaves that pulsed from the creature's core battered them relentlessly, each wave threatening to knock them from their bikes. Yet they pushed through, feeling the weight of the entity's recognition like a silent challenge woven into the psychic pressure. The creature tracked them with greater precision than ever before, its awareness sharpened and directed at them with a force that felt almost territorial. The entity raised one of its massive limbs and thrust it downward, not as a blind strike, but as a targeted blow meant to crush the squad beneath. The impact shattered the ground in a direct line, sending splinters of stone and shards of crystalline soil shooting outward like shrapnel. The returning squad split in 3 directions, each rider skimming across the ruptured terrain mere moments before the limb crashed down with enough force to send a shockwave through the veil. The shockwave rippled outward in concentric rings, each ring carrying a psychic resonance that distorted vision and created momentary lapses in spatial continuity. Across the battlefield, the rest of the Legion responded with a coordinated shift in formation. Riders surged along the creature's flanks, using the terrain distortions to build momentum as they descended down newly formed slopes and launched themselves up fractured ridges. The sky above crackled with lightning drawn toward the creature's pulsing core, creating a symphony of blinding flashes that illuminated the riders in bursts as they executed precision maneuvers. Dust and debris swirled through the air in tight spirals as the corruption of the terrain interacted with the storm's natural currents. The White Scars adjusted their assault, recognizing that the creature's current form prioritized defense and control rather than raw aggression. Its stability made it less vulnerable to disruption, and its limbs acted more like pillars shaping the battlefield rather than weapons meant to strike directly. The solution lay not in attacking its structure but in destabilizing its equilibrium. Riders began attacking from multiple elevations, using broken slopes and shifting hills to launch themselves at angles that forced the entity to redistribute its mass repeatedly. Each forced adjustment caused minor distortions within its core, visible as fluctuations in the luminous pulse that radiated from its body. As the entity's equilibrium began to falter, the returning squad seized the opportunity to press even harder. They formed a tight wedge formation, engines screaming as they accelerated toward the base of the creature's torso. The terrain warped beneath them, rising and falling in chaotic patterns, yet the riders maintained cohesion through sheer mastery of momentum and instinct. They weaved through collapsing ridges and sudden spikes of stone, moving with a determination that carved a focused line of attack through the instability. The creature sensed their approach and retaliated with a massive sweeping motion. Its limbs split into multiple segments mid-swing, each segment extending outward like branching appendages of a colossal root structure. The tendrils swept across the ground in overlapping arcs, tearing through ridges, crushing rock outcroppings, and generating shockwaves that radiated out like liquid force. Riders accelerated to outrun the sweeping destruction, leaning sharply into turns and diving through gaps that closed behind them as the tendrils slammed into the terrain. The returning squad evaded the first sweep, only to encounter the second, which descended in a crushing arc. The riders split apart at the last possible moment, surging through narrow gaps between collapsing rock and twisting tendrils. One rider skimmed so close to the creature's limb that corrupted energy brushed across his armor, leaving a streak of warped metal that pulsed faintly. Yet he remained upright, forced forward by sheer momentum and instinct, becoming part of a formation that refused to yield. The shockwaves forced the larger legion formation to fall back slightly, but the riders maintained the pressure through constant motion. They darted across the battlefield in complex spirals and angled assaults, denying the creature any opportunity to stabilize fully. Dust storms rose around them, swirling into towering columns that cast distorted shadows across the battlefield. The storm above seemed to grow more violent, as though reacting to the rising volatility of the creature's form. Finally, the entity's core flickered, not weakening, but destabilizing. Its mass shuddered. Its limbs retracted slightly. Its torso rippled with internal compression. The returning squad surged forward again, reaching the threshold of its collapsing equilibrium just as the creature began a violent internal shift. The creature was collapsing, not dying, but transforming, and the riders accelerated toward the epicenter, entering the storm at the exact moment it began to break open. The creature's collapse did not resemble defeat, but instead a violent reconfiguration of matter, intention, and force. Its torso contracted inward like a vortex folding upon itself, drawing in the corrupted terrain with a hunger that ignored all natural boundaries. The ground shuddered as the soil slid inward, pulled toward the center of an imploding sphere of distortion. Ridges fractured and spiraled downward, sinking into a newly forming basin of unnatural geometry. Fragments of rock, debris, and even remnants of the fog spiraled inward in jagged spiraling arcs, swallowed by the creature's shifting mass. The landscape convulsed under the strain, reshaping itself with each pulse of unstable energy that radiated outward in concentric waves. The white scars felt the pull immediately. Their engines strained, roaring in protest as bikes fought the gravitational distortion. The ground beneath them tilted sharply, threatening to slide them into the imploding center, yet the riders adapted with instinctual precision. They counter-angled their bikes, applying bursts of power at critical moments to ride the collapsing terrain like shifting waves. Even as the battlefield crumbled, they found momentum, carving paths across falling ridges and sliding slopes. Dust and shattered stone engulfed their wheels, but speed remained their ally, the one constant force resisting the pull of corruption. At the center of the battlefield, where the returning squad had advanced, the collapse was strongest. They rode along the narrowing circumference of the vortex as the terrain shrank behind them, their path diminishing with every passing second. The storm overhead intensified, lightning falling in rapid succession around the battlefield as if the heavens themselves sought to unravel the creature's final form. Each flash illuminated the distorted structure that writhed within the imploding space, an entity half-formed, neither solid nor vapor, attempting to compress itself into a shape that the world continued to reject. The creature's limbs folded inward, like retracting appendages of a colossal organism. Its featureless face dissolved into ripples of motion, losing coherence as its internal geometry buckled. Its pulsing core dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, oscillating in a pattern that reflected a struggle between preservation and collapse. With each contraction, its pull on the battlefield intensified, threatening to draw everything into the heart of its transformation. The returning squad pushed their engines to their limits, attempting to outrun the contraction's expanding edge. Soil disintegrated behind them, shifting into jagged fragments that tumbled toward the vortex. The riders leaned hard into the unstable terrain, weaving between falling rock formations and surging distortions of gravity. For a moment, the entire world seemed to tilt, as though the battlefield were a bowl beginning to invert upon itself. The rest of the legion maneuvered outward, creating distance from the collapsing center. Dust storms rose across the veil, spiraling into massive columns that twisted upward toward the storm clouds. the air filled with conflicting pressures, waves of compressed force pushing outward from the creature's core while gravitational pull dragged inward. The resulting turbulence turned the battlefield into a maelstrom of violent winds and shifting light. The returning squad finally reached the perimeter of the collapse, just as the terrain behind them gave way entirely. The ground fell inward in a massive downward spiral, revealing a fissure that plunged deep into the earth. Through the fissure, the creature's reshaping form pulsed violently. A shockwave erupted from the center, sending ripples of distortion through the air that scattered debris like shrapnel. The riders accelerated beyond the perimeter just as the shockwave hit, their engines wailing as they blasted past the collapse's boundary. The battlefield convulsed once more, then fell eerily still. For several seconds, no sound existed except the fading rumble of settling stone and the distant echoes of thunder as the storm began to dissipate. The dust slowly parted, unveiling a newly formed crater at the center of the vale, vast, circular, and unnaturally smooth, as though carved by a celestial force. At its depths, a dim glow flickered, pulsing weakly like the breath of a buried ember struggling to survive. The creature was gone, yet not entirely defeated. Its presence lingered as a residual vibration in the air, a faint distortion that hummed at the edge of perception. The white scars felt it in their armor, in their bones, in the lingering static that clung to the battlefield. The returning squad halted their bikes on the crater's rim, looking upon the silent basin. Though no expressions marked their helmets, the weight of understanding settled upon them like the remnants of dust falling from the sky. The entity had not been destroyed. It had retreated. It had adapted. It had survived the confrontation by folding itself into the fractured geometry beneath the earth, waiting, evolving, learning. The storm clouds dispersed gradually, revealing a sky dimmed by the after-effects of unnatural conflict. The air cleared enough for distant mountains to re-emerge from the haze, though their silhouettes wavered slightly, as if uncertain of their own boundaries after the distortion. The wind carried the faint scent of scorched ozone and corrupted soil, remnants of a battle that had scarred the land far beyond mere impact. The Legion regrouped across the vale, forming a tightened perimeter around the crater. No words were exchanged, but the formation itself conveyed the unspoken conclusion. The land would remain under watch, and the creature's presence would be monitored. The returning squad positioned themselves at the forefront of this perimeter, their bikes idling softly as they observed the silent crater below. For now, the battlefield had quieted. For now, the storm had broken. But the White Scars knew, as all warriors of the open steppe understood, that storms did not end. They merely shifted, gathering strength beyond the horizon. The crater pulsed faintly once more, then fell dark, and the riders turned their engines toward the distant edge of the vale, following the unbroken trail that awaited them beyond the corrupted battlefield, carrying with them the weight of what had been confronted and the knowledge of what might return.